they raised a veritable tornado of questions. And it just goes to show, I think, just how complicated and treacherous these issues are. And I do think that there has been something of a tendency to underestimate how complicated the issues are. Let me start. I think Roberto Pick's main point was that I was still committed to a form of circularity, and that is also common to Paulo Faria's point. So let me delay answering that. I'll just start with Ramneta and then come to some of these points. One small thing is that the Ram rightly notes that I argue both that epistemic relativism is false and self-defeating, but he thinks that the argument that I take to be the argument establishing falsity is the one I took to establish pragmatic self-defeat. That is the argument for the falsity of epistemic relativism, at least as formulated, strictly speaking, is the argument from the falsity of confrontation, generally understood. The argument for self-defeat is the argument that we could not adopt a generally relativistic attitude towards our own epistemic practices on pain of coming to think that we didn't really have reason for believing one thing rather than another. Now, Ram raises a good question about that. He says, look, the way I'm putting it, that I say our only rationale for accepting our own epistemic system is that we think of it as the only correct way of arriving at the truth. And he says, well, what does this exactly mean? It sounds like it's either a reason, in which case why should we have a reason for adopting our epistemic system, or it could mean a causal explanation, but then who knows, the causal explanation may be something else. But it wasn't really meant in that way. The idea was simply this: if we came to adopt a relativistic view, then our attachment to our own epistemic system would be at best that of our attachment to etiquette. But the same kinds of explanations that are available to explain why we would be attached to our etiquette systems aren't available in the case of the epistemic systems. There isn't any way in which they are a manifestation of certain kinds of aesthetic values that we consider to be fundamental to who we are, who we happen to be. And so it would become unmoored. There is really no attachment that we have to modus ponens, except for the fact that we think that really is truth-preserving, and that really does transmit justification as opposed to other things that don't. And if we're deprived of that thought, basically I don't see how we could explain, except through inertia, why we're attached to the particular epistemic systems that we have. And that would, I think, then lead us to think, if you really followed through on it, that one didn't really have a good reason for believing one thing, as opposed to believing the opposite thing that's yielded by some other epistemic system, which you have just now acknowledged. His only hold on you, right, would be analogous to that which etiquette has on you, and not even that. So it's really about the counterfactuals that would be true were we to come to adopt the relativistic view of our epistemic systems, rather than some putative causal explanation for why we had them in the first place. A second point that Ram raises is he says, look, I'm sympathetic to the idea that relativism is not true, and that it doesn't follow from confrontation with actual alternatives. But isn't this largely because we haven't been treated to a clear statement of relativism more generally? Now, this is absolutely right. It's one of the many issues about which I could have gone on for about half an hour, but couldn't. There is a very serious problem explaining how to formulate a relativistic view about anything, let alone about epistemology or about justification. But here's the funny thing. There is a problem about that, even with respect to domains about which relativism is clearly right. Now, here's a domain about which relativism is clearly right. And usually you think, well, any particular case you think of might be controversial. Certainly morality is controversial. Even etiquette, in some ways, is controversial because there are aspects of the formulation that you might think of as optional that could go a different way, even in the case of etiquette. But about the legal, take the notion of the legal. There are no absolute facts about what is legal, okay? There are only relative facts. There are legal codes that vary from country to country, and then there is a question of what they permit or prohibit. What's legal according to the U.S. code may not be legal according to the Brazilian code, and so on. I think if there is anything that is tailor-made for the kind of relativistic treatment that I describe as relativism about justification, it is the notion of the legal. Okay. Now, if you actually think about it, there is a problem about explaining what relativism about the legal would amount to, given the template that I offer. Because you ask yourself, what is a code? So what we say is, there are many alternative legal codes, right, none of which accurately reflect the absolute legal facts better than any others, because there are no absolute legal facts. And if our legality judgments are to have any prospect of being true, they have to assume the form according to legal code C, blah, blah, blah. But what is a code? Now, the natural thing is to think that it's a series of propositions passed by an appropriate body. But you just finished saying that there are no propositions of the form, this is legal, that's illegal. That is, the natural understanding is, and what you really mean to be saying is, you're restricted to propositions of the form X is legal according to the U.S. legal code, and the U.S. legal code consists of a series of propositions of the form, this is legal, that's illegal. But you've just finished saying there are no such propositions. Okay. So even formulating it vis-a-vis a domain for which it is clearly appropriate. And of course what you don't want to do is say, oh, well, the code itself is relative to the U.S. legal code, the following thing is legal or illegal. So there is, in fact, a very delicate issue about how to describe the codes to which you're relativizing, even in domains where it's quite uncontroversial. And then a further problem in saying what it is to say about those codes that they are equally correct. I have views about this, but I think it would be too much of a detour to go into them. The important point is that I didn't want to take that kind of criticism of epistemic relativism, because I think that's a problem that you get quite generally, even where it is appropriate. I won't say very much about the so-called boring kind of relativism. I'm not sure how boring it is, but there's a kind of, I don't think Ram had enough time to lay it out and motivate it. And you see, one thing he said, well, look, what I mean is there could be two overall equally good representations of all the epistemic facts, and one of which would yield the conclusion that Galileo is justified, one of which would yield the conclusion Galileo is unjustified. And then that somehow to be motivated by some facts about the epistemic norms, including more material in their antecedents than we are able to discriminate between. But I don't really know how that argument is supposed to go. The first thought is already the problematic one, namely that there are two equally good representations of all the epistemic facts and they're yielding conflicting verdicts. That's going to occasion this problem about how relativism is best described, because it looks like we've just got a contradiction there to begin with, never mind how it's to be motivated. So, okay. Now, to come to Paul Farrier's explosion of interesting points and questions, and many of which were alluding to previous work. and asking very, very interesting questions about the relation between that work and this work. Let me say, there's one, so I won't go into all the details, of course, but there's one very large thing that's going on in the relation between this and this other paper called How Are Objective Epistemic Reasons Possible? That paper and some surrounding papers, including one called Knowledge of Logic, but also Blind Reasoning, which actually supersedes some of the others in certain respects. Never mind. What I was trying to do there is develop the idea that there are circumstances under which you could give a rule circular justification for a basic logical principle, where let's distinguish between reasoning according to an inference rule and the belief that that inference rule is truth-preserving. So then the idea is, many people have thought, look, it's simply impossible for you to acquire a justified belief in the validity of the principle. It has to be inferential, because at some point with respect to the very basic principle, you'd have to use an instance of the corresponding rule to arrive at justified belief about the general proposition, this rule is truth-preserving. And the idea was, I mean, it was already, I think, prefigured in James Van Cleve's paper on epistemic principles, and though I guess in Ernie's work, since there's a distinction between two kinds of knowledge, I'm not sure that maps on exactly the same way. But it was an attempt to flesh out that, but it's not enough to simply say there is a difference and maybe we can bootstrap our way up. The idea is to show in detail that your entitlement to reason in certain ways can be fleshed out independently of your entitlement to the belief. Because if it weren't like that, then you'd really be in trouble. So you really have to have some story about why your entitlement to reason in certain ways could really be grounded in, for instance, facts about concept constitution and their surrounding epistemic principles that would then allow you to say, look, I'm not really begging the question in a substantive way, to use that to move to some general proposition. But all of that was done, you see, I mean, to connect up some of the dots from this morning and now, it was always understood that that kind of argument, its limitation would be that it would be dialectically ineffective against skeptics. Okay. So the main difference between those papers and this paper is that I discovered the skeptic within. That is, I mean it in a very specific technical sense. That is, in situations of confrontation, when you are confronted by an alternative, workable, seemingly workable epistemic practice, it's not only natural but even appropriate to come to have doubts about the correctness of your own epistemic principles. And in that case, the rule circular arguments that I provided are dialectically ineffective against even yourself. That is, not just on putative others. So that's why this paper assumes the course that it does. That is, it doesn't just say, well, it's not just the difference between the logical principles and all the other ones, though there is that difference too. There is also the fact that you're operating in a context where if you're giving the relativist as much slack as he wants, you're operating in a context where you have raised a doubt in your own mind. And now these arguments look ineffective. So then Paolo asks, well, look, what about these two alternatives? Right, both the generalized inferentialism and the kind of general constraints on the basis of a priori arguments. And the idea is, if I'm right about the general setting in which we've got a real confrontation between fundamentally different systems, it doesn't matter what your principles are, whether you've got meaning-based principles that extend all the way to these other principles, or you've got a priori insight into the truth of certain principles. The fact that what you're trying to do is provide some argument that will silence a skeptic either without or within makes them dialectically ineffective. It doesn't matter what form they take. And that's what leads me to then wonder, well, do we really have instances of fundamentally different epistemic systems? And aren't there built-in limitations on our ability to come up with such. And then the final point is, both of which the answer to which is yes. And then the final point is that we know from the falsity of confrontation, quite generally, that there have to be some objective epistemic facts, because it's simply not true that no matter what, we don't even understand the proposition. No matter what the system is like, we couldn't persuade ourselves that our system was better than another one. So if there are at least some such facts, what is to prevent us from supposing that there is exactly the range of such facts as our normal system usually assumes? That's the dialectic. But I agree that there are an enormous number of outstanding problems and questions. So is that the end?
Yes. Tom.